Welcome back to the Code Ryan podcast. Today, my guest is Craig Dennis, and I found Craig through a great course that he had over on Free Code Camp's YouTube channel, in which he discussed APIs, and he did a super awesome deep dive over on their channel. So definitely recommend checking that out and really all of Craig's stuff. But that's going to be the topic of our discussion today is APIs, kind of what they are, why they're useful. But kind of before we get into that, Craig, if you were riding in like an Uber or a Lyft and he turned around and asked you, so what do you do for a living? How would you kind of respond to that?
I love it. I love it. Love that question. Yeah, and that happens all the time, right? Like that's just such a great question. And typically what I say is I teach. I'm a teacher. I'm a developer educator. And then typically what happens, you go back and forth with the Uber driver and they're like, oh, really? Oh, I'm learning how to code. And almost always it's like, I'm learning how to code. It's like, oh, I've thought about it or I tried coding. And I kind of dig in there a little bit about like, how'd you get stuck and that sort of thing. So, you know, that like what inspires you, what are you trying to build, and we play in that space. I really enjoy that. I really like to that point. I enjoy working in the space of getting people to be able to learn and be able to follow their passion wherever that may lead. And I'm a developer educator is my official title.
And are there particular areas that you like to focus on? I know you're definitely very knowledgeable when it comes to APIs. Are there kind of other areas that you like to focus on as well?
Yeah, sure. So I really enjoy early in career coding. So I like taking people from writing their first Hello World program into thinking about what they can build with it, and whatever language that may be. I've taught in Java and Python and JavaScript, and you know, it leads into stuff like APIs or web development and things like that. So
absolutely awesome. Well, I think that's good kind of background on yourself. But now let's kind of transition into our topic today. So I think a good place for us to start here, and I know that when I first started programming, this was a little bit tricky. It like hearing the words API or this kind of acronym, it was kind of abstract to me. I didn't really understand it. So kind of what even are we talking about when we say API?
Yeah, and you know that problem that you're talking about right there is so common. And I know from researching about how to teach this thing, right? Like everybody hears that term, you hear it all the time. I'll just use an API for that, or there's an API, or there's a string API. Well, what is API? I thought I knew what an API was, and it's this concept, right? So like, if we break it down, and we'll go deeper than this, but if we break it down, we have application programming interface. Okay, that's what it stands for, application programming interface. And I like to take that last bit, that interface, and we talk about interfaces that you've like seen. And I think that this is probably the cleanest way to talk about it is an interface like on the example that I used in the course on a radio, right? So it's got a volume knob and it's got a channel switcher, and like, I don't know about you, Ryan, but I don't know how that works. I know that when I turn the thing, it does it, but I don't know how it works. And I'm okay with that, right? There's this like level of abstraction that's there. And it turns out that like, you don't want to keep building that over and over again as an application programmer. You want to have these interfaces, and they show up. Like, for instance, I think just about every single place where you'd ever build an application, you need a button, right? You need some sort of button that you can click. And that button is an interface. It's a way for you, the user, to interface with this thing. And so an API is really for you, the programmer, to interface with these abstractions that have been given to you. And like, what can you play with here? What are you allowed to work with? Now, one of the problems, and I'm sure that we'll get into this as we dive a little bit deeper in your questions, is that the term has been overloaded. So much so that whenever somebody says, "Have you seen their API?" they're not talking about the in the code API. They're talking about a web-based API. But it is like super important to know that APIs are everywhere, and that's why you hear them, right? Like a string, a string of characters has an API, and all of the programming languages have this string API, and you call to uppercase, and it will uppercase that string. And that's an interface that you could probably build that yourself, but you don't need to because someone's given you that abstraction. So they've given you that method, and you don't know how they're doing it. I don't know how that works. I mean, I've read about it. I've read about how do I make go from a lowercase a to an uppercase a, and there's something about character sets and that sort of stuff. But there's this interface that exists that I can use where I don't need to know what that is.
So it kind of provides this way to more or less, one way I heard it explained early on, and it kind of helped things click for me as well, is it kind of provides this interface, like you said, to kind of communicate with other programs that kind of allows you to leverage those programs in your own program. And like you said, you don't really have to understand all the inner workings of that other program because they just provide this nice interface that you can interact with and kind of communicate with.
Yeah, and I think like the word that comes on the other side of that interface is implementation, which in itself is a long word and always like, well, no, what does implementation mean? And it's like whatever the code is that's over there, right? So like this API is masking that implementation. And you see that in most programming languages have this concept of an interface and an implementation. And you don't ever really think about what the implementation is because you trust that other things are there. And that's what this is. This is an API is wrapping that around it.
Awesome. Well, I think that kind of is a good description to kind of what an API is and to kind of cover what we're talking about here. But why should a programmer even care about an API? Like, why are they even useful?
Yeah, that's a great question, and let's stay low level, and then let's work our way up a little bit, right? So to that point that we were just talking about, like how do I make this string uppercase? If this API didn't exist, I would have to know how to do that, and I have to write that myself. And I don't know about you, but I've been hired at places, and they don't want me writing that. Right? I want to be focusing on the thing that's supposed to be at hand. And somebody's already figured out all the science for that. They've figured out, how do I sort this array? There's this API called to sort this array. And maybe there's different implementations that I'm going to choose there, but it's going to be the best way. I could probably write that, but that's not what I should be writing, right? I should be using these interfaces. I should be trusting these implementations that exist out there. And this goes a little bit farther, right? Like there's like not just working in your programming languages APIs, but there's also these APIs from other libraries that you could go and get and pull down, and they're very specific, right? And like you don't need to know how to do this stuff because this library exists, and we might have used them, or you might have thought about. I think one of the ones I still blows me away. It's like how do you make a black and white photo? Like all the apps that do that black and white photo, there's some sort of computer science there where you're like, okay, so we're going to take this and we're going to run a scale across this, some sort of grayscale. Oh, that's the word grayscale. But I don't need to know how to do that because I just download this library and I call to black and white, the API call, and it gives me this black and white grayscale image. And I love that. I love that I'm able, it's like these superpowers, right? And so the more that you start embracing the fact that these things exist and you don't need to write that stuff. And I feel like there's this leap in when you're first starting to write coding where you're doing this if else and you're like thinking through all of it, like how do I make this go? And then oh wait, some of this stuff's already been worked out and there are these things that I can use and they're trusted in the community for that sort of thing. So that's at that level API. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I know that when I first started programming, it's like all these tasks that you're eventually going to have to do to create like a full program become kind of daunting. It's like handling authentication, or maybe you want to incorporate maps in your program or different things like that. And when you think about like, oh my gosh, how am I ever going to write all the code for this? Well, actually, you don't have to. You can use different APIs that already are programs that have been written that you can just interact with and interface with to kind of leverage those within your own program. And then that allows you this functionality to where, for example, you have the Google Maps API, and that allows you to use maps within your own program. And you don't have to worry about managing everything that Google does with that API. So I think that provides like a good kind of understanding of why they're useful. Now, you kind of hinted at this already, and I know you covered this in your course as well when kind of going over what an API is, but just to potentially backtrack just slightly,
Sure.
Where do these APIs exist? Are they just on the web, or are they, where are they kind of at?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? So like, the ones that run on your computer, right? So that black and white one, that the code is stored someplace else, but I download that and I put that inside of my application and I run that code that goes and changes something to black and white. Or the string API that's locally on my machine here. But what happens is there's a couple of things that happen. So first of all, you don't have all the space on your computer. You don't have all the processing power on your computer. You don't have all the data on your computer. Let's go back. I use this in the course, and I feel like this might help a little bit. When I'm talking about the radio, I also start talking about Spotify, right? Because Spotify is like our radio these days, and Spotify, all those songs aren't on my phone. My phone is big. It has a lot of gigabytes on it, but it's not that big, right? And so when I go to get that song, it needs to go and it hits an external source, right? This external API, and so and it's pulling that song and it's streaming that data across, also using an API. Now, on my local, I have an Android phone. On my Android phone, I have an application, and that application has uses some APIs that Android has given us, right? So Android's like, this is how you build a form, and this is how you do that. So the Spotify team built an application that's running locally on my machine, but the data and other things are coming across from this web-based API. And Spotify is a great example of that. And there's some more where it's like, this is just an API, and this API exists, and it could actually make money, right? So somebody has to pay for it. Somebody has to pay for where those servers are, and you could actually sell the API. So Google Maps is an example of that. Google Maps that you brought up earlier. Google Maps, I don't have all of the mapping data on my computer, and I don't know if I'd be able to process all of that information. So it is actually, the app itself is hitting a web-based API, and it's using the web to pull down data and send data up and do the processing and tell me somehow, I don't know. I mean, that API is amazing now when it's like, you're going to get there at 3:04 p.m. and it's like an hour drive and I get there at 3:04 p.m. Like, that is amazing. And the fact that it's using that and it's using all this different data, there's no way that my phone's doing that. It's doing it up on the web, and it's calculating all of the people coming in together and all sorts of powerful. But to me, if I were to write that, I'm sure that there's a couple of API calls I could say that says, how long will it take to get from point A to point B? And it will give me that answer. And that's the API call that I make. And that's what I could show in my application, which is really incredibly powerful, because now it's not running on my local machine. I'm not limited by what's on my machine. I'm able to connect over the internet to these providers, these API providers, to control things or get information or just really whatever, like in the same sort of way where it's like, I don't know how it does. I don't know how Google does that, but with the API call, I don't need to. I just know that I can get that information there, and I trust that Google's given me that information.
I think that kind of provides a good overview of what an API is, an application programmer interface. It allows you to kind of communicate with these other programs, to leverage them in your own program, to just be able to develop more things and increase the speed of development and build more kind of cool things. And we talked about where they exist. So they don't have to exist just like internally. Yes, like the language of JavaScript technically has APIs for, like you said, uppercasing a string, lowercasing a string, all these different kind of methods that you can use within the language. But you also have these external APIs that you can access through the internet, that are kind of external to your program. So you don't need to manage all that data in your own program and stuff like that. And I think when kind of using these APIs, one very common thing that people will hear of is a REST API. And people will kind of hear, okay, this API is a RESTful API. But I know when I first started out, I didn't really know what that means. It was kind of just like, I'll smile and nod my head along with this, whatever. But kind of, what is a REST API, and what does someone mean when an API is RESTful?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there's some history packed into that, and it took some time to actually make that happen, because like, as you can imagine, if you're trying to connect to some sort of external program, the same sort of way that we're like calling APIs, and you're trying to call it on some other system, somehow that system needs to tell you how it works, right? And so you need to, like, either there's documentation and there's no like standards, and this was tried a lot, right? Because we needed to be able to now even more so, there's more processing power on your computer, but back in the day there didn't used to be a lot of processing power. And even in the web servers that were using some of these APIs, and so there was these different standards that tried to come out, and one of them, probably the most famous one that was around, is called SOAP. And it's I'll try Simple Object Access Protocol, and it comes across in XML, and it's like very very large and strange, and it comes back, and you have to play in this space. And it was like cool what you could do with it, but it was hard for it to be adopted. And I think that as the web moved forward and we saw what we were doing with the web, we started thinking about, oh, wait a second, wouldn't it be cool if we could access these resources, these like web pages that are out there? Like, think about, so hard not just to go right to the course, because like I already thought about this and I'm like looking for an analogy, and it's like, oh yeah, that's the analogy I used in the course. But like Amazon, like, so we're shopping on Amazon, right? And Amazon has the URL bar, and it changes, and we're like looking at shirts, and then we're looking at men's shirts, and then we're looking at these different, and the URL changes, and like we go to a very specific page, we see a list of things, and then we see a very specific page, and that here is some items, and here is a specific item, is very common in that. And when we talk about items in that case, we use the word item because it's like this generic term. Well, REST exposes a thing called resources. So it's like the resource that's on the web, and it lets you access it programmatically. Now, REST is representational state transfer. So I like to think about this like when I'm looking at a web page and I'm looking at that Amazon page, it's got a bunch of data on it that, like, if I'm looking at another item that's similar, all the data is kind of living in the same sort of space where it's like, oh, that's the price. That's when I could get it by shipping. This is the button I need to press for that. You can see the same state of that in a programmatic way. And typically the way that it shows you that is through JSON, right? So JavaScript object notation. It's like a little, it's the lingua franca of the web. Like, so it's like it's an object that comes across, and there in the way that resource would be represented in JSON, I would see, here's the title, here's the price, here's how long it would take me to ship. And I see it in a different way. I see it in data in the same way that I would kind of look at it there. So a lot of times that's what APIs that have been exposed for properties that have forward-facing entities, that's what it looks like. So you have an actual resource that you can get the data from it, and you can see what state it's in. And then just like how I can collect, I'm going to keep going on the Amazon example. I haven't played with this one. I don't know where it ends up. But so if I were to click the purchase button, I'm probably sending a post command, right? Like in typical web forms, I'm sending a form submission that I would like to buy this. I could do something very similar probably in the REST command. I could say, go to purchases, and I'm going to make a new purchase. I'm going to post this purchase, and I'm going to put in some information there. And I'm pretty sure that that's how the Amazon API works. Now, I'm pretty sure that that's how it works because it's following a REST implementation. I think it does. I haven't played with the Amazon API yet, but I feel comfortable enough that there's this structure, this representational state transfer, and it's the style of, there's a resource, and you can interact with this resource. I can see what's going on with this resource. I can create a new one of these resources. I can update one of these resources in some cases. Like, obviously Amazon's not going to let me update that. But if I did create a purchase order, that'd be a new resource that I created, like a new purchase, and I could update the amount of items that I wanted there. I want 2 there, so I could probably make a post to that. And I think what's really cute about the way that REST works is it kind of sits on top of HTTP the same way that the web sits on top of things. So like get, post, and then there's a flip side of that where you can do that in the program in the same sort of way. So like there's a really nice parallel to it, and it's like you using that same sort of resource mapping that probably was done on the site. Probably the API looks like that. And there's these standards that exist that when they meet these set of constraints is what it's called, because this is a style, right? This is not a protocol. It's a style that you should follow. There's this set of constraints that happen. And when you meet those constraints, and only when you meet those constraints, do you get the cute title of being called RESTful, right? So that's the you meet the constraints of the representational state transfer, and it's RESTful. And there's a pretty detailed set of constraints. And at this point, if you were to go write your own REST, if you were going to go build a new API, there's tools, and it comes out, and everything you make is going to be RESTful because the constraints are cooked in to the API. By the way, the API of the web server that's generating this API. So there's a lot of APIs in there, but yeah, that's REST in a nutshell.
It ends up being APIs all the way down. So
for sure, yeah.
And with that, I think you kind of teed things up very well for kind of the follow-up question to this. And that's going to be kind of, what are some of these constraints? And before you kind of go into that a little bit, just to let the audience know, your course, you dive into these, and like, this is a good portion of the course, diving into all these different constraints and showing examples and all this stuff. So, I don't expect you to do all that here, but maybe just from like a high level, what are maybe a few of the kind of core constraints that a RESTful API is going to kind of abide to or be kind of styled for?
Sure. I think the one that makes the most sense, and like we've been talking about a little bit, but not very specifically. And what's nice about this is that you're saying that there is a client and there is a server. So one of the constraints is that it's a client server based architecture. So the client, in this case, much like how when we're talking about using your web browser as a client, and the server is the web server that you're hitting at the end of that URL. In the same sort of way, you have a client, you could have a RESTful client, right, that connects to this API. It's also your programming language has some way of, because these talk over HTTP, your programming language has some way of doing that. So you create your own little client that is connecting to this server, and that's one of the constraints that are there. And yeah, so another one. Let's do statelessness. So statelessness is one of the constraints, is that there is no state. It has no idea who you are. Every time you make that request as a client to the server, you need to say, hey, this is who I am. This is what I'm planning on doing. And you cannot assume that the server knows anything. And if you do build state into it, you've broken the rules. You've broken the rules of the fact that I need to remember. So you need to provide a way for me to let you know what my state is, maybe how I'm logging in or those sort of things. But every single request that you do, you need to give it some sort of way of knowing what the state is, because it itself is stateless. You send the request and the response comes back and it's done. It doesn't remember that was going on. Statelessness is kind of an interesting one to try to like explain, but it's something that we know as web developers, right? Like, you need to figure out, we figured it out with those cookies, right? You set a cookie and then the cookie comes through, and that you know that you're on a session, and then in the server you grab the session of what's going on over there, and the same sort of problem exists at that level. There's this thing called uniform design, which I like, and I think if you ever find a place where these fall apart, where they like, hey, this doesn't actually do what it's supposed to do. This isn't actually RESTful, where you can like point your finger at it. There's this thing that's called hypertext. What is it? HATEOAS. HATEOAS. Hypertext as an engine of application state, and basically it's letting you know what else is available. So it's really nice. Like, you can hypothetically, without any API documentation, if you have one API endpoint, you should be able to discover all the things that you can do with it. So it's like, here's the link of all the images. So let's do fun thing about this is you can always just invent something, right? So let's do a picture sharing site. There's photos, and I want to see all of the albums that this is in. When I get the list back from me, when I go look at one photo, let's say that I got a URL to an API call to look at one photo, I would get probably the location of where the photo is, what the title of it is, and there should be this section called links, and I should be able to see all of the places where the albums that this is in. And if I follow that link, it's going to be a link to another API, and it's basically like how we navigate the web. You should be able to navigate it, a RESTful API, that way. You should be able to go, here are the things that I need to know to go and click and go through. So again, these constraints are like one of those things where it's like, what I don't like about this education is that there's like 7 or 8 of these, right? Like, I think there's 8, and one of them's optional. a lot of times the way this is educated is that it's taught all up front, and I think that's rough. That's rough if you're like just trying to get into this, like you're worrying about these things. Like these are not something that, if you're writing your own, you should worry about it maybe, or make sure that the tool that you're using to generate it has them. But like it's not something that you necessarily need to worry about, but it is something that you might be tested about. That's the big flip around there. But like if you use a RESTful API, all the other APIs that are RESTful should feel similar to that. Like they should feel, oh, I understand how this works. And it's amazing. It's amazing once you use one that is RESTful, because now you're like, wow, I have all of these that are available to me. And there's companies that list all of the APIs that are out there, or try to make them more uniform even. Yeah.
Yep. So it's kind of this more standard way to interact with different APIs on the web. And I think you make a great point about like, you don't need to know and memorize every single constraint and know the ins and outs of it. Like me as a professional front-end engineer, I don't know all the constraints. I don't know every single detail about them, but I do think it's important to just have a general knowledge of when using a RESTful API, there are these constraints, and you might kind of bump up into them now and then. But it's just kind of just general overview to know that they have these constraints and that there is this standard to kind of communicate with these. And, not every API you interact with is technically going to be a REST API. There's things like GraphQL as well. And you mentioned SOAP earlier. Those probably quite a bit less common nowadays. I think still the most common, I haven't seen data on this, but I believe it's still REST APIs. And then GraphQL is kind of getting a little bit of, potentially is the newer kid on the block and getting a little bit more kind of attention and stuff lately. But I think that just understanding that there's some of these different standards for APIs that provide a more common interface to interact is kind of good knowledge to know. So kind of from that, I think a good place for us to go, and we just have a few minutes left here, but when someone's thinking about using an API, how is that typically done? Like, do they use it from the command line? Do they use it within JavaScript? Do they need to import like a helper library? Is it all of the above?
I was going to say,
how's it kind of work there?
I was going to say the answer to that question is yes. Yeah. So there's lots of different ways. There's tools that are out there that let you explore APIs, which I highly recommend. We look at that in the course. There's a tool that like dominated for a very long time, which I still think is great. There's a tool called Postman, and it has so many bells and whistles that lets you kind of go and explore, and lets you just kind of play around. And I think that that's a really nice way of thinking about these. It's like, there are a lot of APIs, and you need to go and test and make sure that it's doing what you want it to do, or that it does what you think it can do. And there's ways to do that, because it's nice, because as long as you're following these rules of these clients, there's REST API clients like Postman. There's plugins you can hit it from, like you said, you can hit it from your command line. There's a tool that's been around forever called curl, and it lets you be very specific. And because this sits on top of HTTP, right, it's not its own protocol, you can hit those. GraphQL has this thing too, right? So there's it's really cute. The play on words is like graphical, so it's like GraphQL, because so it's graph query language, right? And this is graphical, so you had to have there's a client to hit this API, this external API, so you can run, see what it looks like, and see what gets returned, to make sure that it's what you want, and then you bring it into it. And oftentimes companies that have APIs will give you a helper library, and it feels like you're running it locally on your machine. And we're back to this, like, turn that photo black and white. It feels like you're like, like I work for a company that runs APIs, and we're like, send a text message. That's the thing that we want it to be able to do. And it does it. And it sends a text message, and you give it the to, the from, and the body. And it feels like when I'm using this helper library, I don't even know that it's hitting an API. It's been, there's an API that abstracts away the API that abstracts away the APIs, and that's what that's what it, like you said, it APIs all the way down. Like it's because these places want you to build. Like that's what's so awesome about APIs, is that these are building tools to do stuff that you don't need to build yourself, and you want to use these, you want to snap these together, Yeah, it's powerful. It's a powerful. I love one of my favorite things about teaching APIs is just watching what people build with it. I love seeing what people build. So
with using APIs, you can definitely leverage them to build some really cool things, and probably a lot faster than you think of when you initially think about like building this application that uses Google Maps and these different things. Like it actually is usually just a few lines of code because there's so many kind of layers of abstraction, and you just kind of work at that top layer and you just kind of have to write a few lines of code and it kind of works out of the box in most instances. So I think they're super powerful to know about. And like you said, the correct answer there was yes, all of the above. You can use them in your command line. You can use them with tools like Postman. You can use them. My channel kind of focuses a lot on JavaScript and React. So specifically, if you're using JavaScript, you might use the fetch method and pass in a URL, and that might be used to hit an API to get some sort of response back. That would be kind of using a API in JavaScript. Me personally, I like to first use a tool like Postman or even the command line just to see what I'm getting returned from the API to kind of make sure that I have the right kind of data structure that I'm expecting coming back. And then I'll kind of implement it within my actual JavaScript script. And I think that's a good way to go about it. But kind of to wrap things up here in just one kind of final question here, if there were just a couple of takeaways that you want people to leave with regarding APIs, what would those takeaways be?
Sure. Yeah. First, the term API is overloaded, and if you were confused by how it's being used in a sentence, try to break down that a little bit more, because context matters, right? People are gonna, if you're ever talking about a company's API, you're talking about this is Facebook's API or this is Twitter's API. They're talking about the API that you use to connect to over the internet. It's their external API. But if you're talking about like, oh, there's an API to do natural language processing, that might be local on your machine. And there is a difference to that. And the reason why it's confusing is because it's not being specified enough there. So like, don't beat yourself up about that, like as you're learning about these. And then I think the other thing is that like, a lot of times things feel overwhelming. Like, I don't know how to do that. I don't know how am I ever going to figure out the distance between these 2 points? Like, is this some sort of like weird geometry mathing? It's like, no, there's an API for that. So something already exists. And we're living in a time really where like, if you can think of something, I bet you there's an API for it. Like if you can think of like, here's a problem that I would like to have. And if there's not, you just found yourself a job. You just found yourself a side gig because these get built for everything. And you'd be really surprised at there is something for everything. And there's libraries too. Like, so we talked about that a little bit, but they provide an API, but they have some code there. So don't feel like you need to write all this code, I think is probably one of the takeaways, right? Of like, know that there's even an API to use an API, right? Like you just said, fetch, right? Fetch is the web API to use that API. So you don't need to know how to make that HTTP request and get the response and turn it into JSON. It just does it, right? Well, with a couple of strange asynchronous calls in there, but like it does it, right? Yeah, they're there. They're in your journey, and it can be a little confusing, but really lean into them. And I think another thing that happens is people are afraid to touch them, and I want people to just go poke it. You're not going to break anything. You're not going to break anything. Like, you're not going to get a huge bill. Just it's okay. Go play a little bit with them, and see what you can build. And then like I don't know, let Ryan know what you built.
Yeah, absolutely. Leave it down in the comments. I'll definitely go check it out. Cool. Well, I think those are great takeaways. I know that when I was first starting out, APIs were kind of just like this abstract thing that was hard to kind of wrap my head around. And I think part of it is, like you said, that main takeaway of it's an overloaded term. People will use this when you're in conversations with developers and engineers in like almost all situations, and you'll kind of just start to think everything's an API. In some sense, like, there's a little bit of truth to that. But like you said, context matters there. And then also, if you get stuck on like a really hard problem, there's probably an API for it and pre-written code that you can interact with and leverage in your programs just to build some more cool things. So thank you so much for coming on today, Craig. If people are wondering, like, where can I learn more about you? Where can I check out this course that we've kind of referred to? Where should they go to find you?
Yeah, so I definitely, if you're interested in this, and if this went a little bit too fast for you, I definitely take my time on the Free Code Camp site there. It's called They call it APIs for Beginners is the name of the course there. And there's some more courses from there. There's notes that are attached there, and you can find more places to find me from there. I'm on the Bird site, but whatever. We don't know if that thing's going to be around anymore.
Yeah, who knows?
But yeah, let's. I think Free Code Camp's the place to go for this one. Let's hit up the APIs for Beginners there. There's an updated one. We just recently updated it. So if you are listening to this and you've seen the previous one, you should check out the new one. Lots of new updated examples and continuing to evolve because APIs evolve, right? So we ended up redoing the course. So
yep, absolutely, and I couldn't recommend it enough. It's a very well done course as well. Like a lot of the tutorials I make is just me screen sharing on my computer, but this course is definitely very well produced and it's a very good course. So definitely recommend that. And yeah, thank you so much for coming on today, Craig. I think you shared a lot of valuable insights to our listeners, and I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Ryan. It was fun.